Everything is going to hell, going to hell, going to hell. Everything is going to hell in Shimizu's palace. Akechi fell into a hole, doo-da, doo-da. Akechi fell down into a hole, oh doo-da-day. By the way, I've decided to give the whole playing music on the tablet while I'm recording a chapter thing a break, since in the last video I uploaded the adverts that played before the songs. They basically killed the last video, and I do apologize for that. Well, you try something new and it doesn't work out, you keep doing what you think is best. What I think is best is getting to the end of this story as soon as I possibly can before the year is finished. So let's go. He fell through a dark so deep it was almost liquid, cracking his elbows and shins on surfaces unseen. His helmet, finally for once, kept him from cracking his skull, but it was still a painful descent. Akechi curled up fatal as the fall went on and on. He felt like he was moving in directions other than downwards. The unseen corridors turned intestinal, forcing him through. When he came to a halt, it took him a while to realize it. And for the record, to be fair, I would be in that exact same position if I was falling down a deep hole such as that and having to get into the position of a pinball just to survive. He unfurled himself, like a hedgehog, wincing at his bruises. That stained grey light here turned everything murky, and his broken visor did little to help matters. It had sustained another crack in his fall. The fissure ran diagonal across his left eye, and everything that it touched became mirrored upon itself. He was in a room, and a room was all it was. And it was The Room. Coming this summer, The Room 2021, starring Tommy Wiseau. Yeah, right. We already had a Room movie about, 18 years ago. We don't need another one. Like the corridors, it was devoid of any character. A mere wooden box, perhaps the size of the theater in which he and Akira had sparred what felt like a century ago. The walls around him groaned and shivered. That rat feet pitter-pat teased at the edges of his hearing. There was no entrance or exit. Whatever gap through which he tumbled had already closed up. Best make my own exit, he muttered to himself, and brushed at his visor. Loki! Livatine flashed gold and struck the nearby wall with a thud. Did I pronounce that right? It barely made a scratch. Akechi stared, nonplussed. It won't work. Loki and his blade faded into embers as Akechi spun in place, his single eye wide. The voice had been so close, he'd expected to feel its breath in his ear. Shimizu! He cautiously backed towards the center of the room. Where are you? I'm here. And you're here. And here we are again. He had never heard Shimizu speak so much at once before, and he was struck by how colorless the boy sounded. There was no emotion or intonation behind that thin rasp, as if the empty noise on telephone lines or between radio stations had grown teeth and tongue. Shimizu said, "He's here too." The planks behind him groaned, and he spun on his heel. His breath stopped cold at what he saw. Akira. Akira come up through the floor, like an act of macabre conjuration. Akira in a plush red velvet chair, with eyes shut and skin clammy with fever sweat. Akira with chains constricting his limbs and chest and neck, wrapped taut around his seat, and yet still moving as they continue to constrict, making him grimace from the depths of whatever unnatural sleep into which he'd been forced. Akechi didn't speak. He rushed forward and grabbed at the chains and recoiled with a high yelp of pain. The rusted metal hadn't lost an unnatural cold. If anything, it had only intensified. He'd only brushed it with his fingertips, and yet his skin throbbed right through his gloves. You can't save him. Any of them. It's too late. It will only get later. And why are you showing me this? Akechi asked, massaging his hand. Attempting to break my spirit? There's no need. He was reminded of the time Shimizu had nearly ambushed him on the streets of the Dead Sea, trying to find a place to hide as the chains jangle surrounded him. It was the same here. That voice came from everywhere at once. You wanted to see him, didn't you? Here he is, and here you are. Why not bring the others along too, then? He dared sarcasm. I'm sure they'd be delighted with you for the reunion. No. Not them. Only you. You're not one of them. You never will be. That shut him up. Shimizu's voice, that dispassionate noise, sounded no different in that moment from the thoughts echoing within his own head. I see you for what you are. The walls shivered again, dislodging dust. I see what you've seen. The holes within and without. The things you've done have been whispered in my ear. You've already arrived at the truth. No future. You would die in a cell or in the gallows. Anywhere. Just not there. He clenched his fists so tight, his claws threatened to lacerate his palms. Those words. The same thing he'd said to Akira after their squabble in the Dead Sea. Were you spying on us? The answer this time was long in coming. He thought he detected hesitation. That telephone hiss. Please stay on the line. It was whispered in my ear, Shimizu said again. I should have heard it sooner. There was no need to chase you. Nothing to take. Nothing to show. Is that supposed to be an apology? You wanted to see him. Here he is. And here I am. Yes. It wasn't just Shimizu's voice that was unnatural. His vocabulary seemed limited, broken, constantly struggling to circle back to those same phrases. About the whole not gonna play music thing. Well, I changed my mind about it. I'm just gonna make it so that it's mute before the adverts. Here we go. You tried to be one of them to find him again. Now you're here. He is found. You can unmask. Akechi thought he heard Shimizu's tone change in that last word, ever so slightly, like he'd spat it out. I'll take care of the rest. You can stay here, apart, as it should be. I'm going to free him, and then we're coming for you. You can't. You won't. But you can try. Kill him if you like. I don't need him anymore. Ah! Akira let out a strangled cry as the chain on his throat bit deep. It's all right if you want to kill yourself too. But I'll come back when the others are gone. If you're still here, I'll show you somewhere else. A quiet place. You can see the end of the world from there. With dim horror, Akechi realized that Shimizu was trying to be magnanimous. It's too late, said Shimizu. It will only get later. Goodbye. There was little indication that he had actually gone. Just a sense of receding pressure, an absence of prickling on Akechi's neck. It was like the difference between being in an empty house and one in which all the occupants were asleep. The weight of other minds had fled. He still called out Shimizu's name once, twice, but heard no answer. Fine, he thought. To the problem at hand. Observe the subject. Akira seated and bound. Key question. Could this be a trick? A cognitive replica was certainly possible. Akechi had experienced enough of that firsthand. But he didn't think it was the case here. Every detail of Akira's garb was perfectly recreated, and the way he spasmed and thrashed was sickeningly real. Shido's cognitions had been excellent because the man had an eye for people, psychopath or not. Shimizu was the other way around. Solitary. Closed in. Akechi didn't think he could even muster up the effort to think up false humans in this palace, let alone the ability. So that meant this was the true Akira, his essence lashed to the fear deceit by Iago's chains. The task? Set him free. He remembered when Iago had seized him after his battle with Akira in the Dead Sea. It had only lasted a few seconds, and yet the pain had felt bigger than the world. Every grain in the metal had been a saw blade, every patch of slime a corrosive acid. In some calm place deep within his frenzied agony, he'd thought that the links had a will of their own. An unspeakable bacterial malice that emanated from the chains and attacked their victims somewhere deeper than flesh and bone. The feeling of hopelessness that had permeated him then had been absolute. But Akira had still broken him free with ease. Iago hadn't been able to drag him off. The chains had still possessed plenty of slack. One good swing from Yoshitsune's blade had diced a lot of them. He didn't think it would be so easy now. The links had bitten so deep into Akira's body that in places they looked melded with flesh and cloth. Severing them now would take incredible precision, and precision and power were often exclusive concepts. Any of his more potent attacks would just obliterate Akira along with his bonds. He gingerly reached out and scraped one of the chains with a claw. Even though his skin didn't make contact, he still felt an arctic chill. Akechi stepped back and drew his laser gun, the weapon born from whatever 2,000 yen novelty Ryuji had grabbed from Akihabara. It actually didn't look too bad, certainly sleeker than his other models. Cables snaked octopoid throughout its frame and glowed softly from within from the weapon's current. It even had an intensity dial. Akechi turned it to the highest setting, and the gun's sudden surge of light and high mosquito whine made him hastily crank it back down again. Now probably wasn't the time to fiddle with the controls. He took careful aim and fired. A beam of burning white light shot out and bounced off a chain as if the metal were mirrored. It nearly took Akechi's head off on the ricochet. He huffed, holstered the gun, and unsheathed the beam sword. Delicately, he held the beam against a link adjacent to the chair, away from Akira's own body, and sliced. The chain didn't so much as smolder. Not impressive, Sakamoto, he sighed, and sheathed the blade again. Akira continued to convulse. Time for a keener edge. He brought his hand up to his cracked and broken visor again and called Loki's name. And the persona's coruscating monochrome form spun itself into being before Akira, slouched upon the blade's hilt, hooves dangling. Akechi stepped back, and Loki angled his head expectantly. Loki had been an excellent means to an end, or so he'd thought for a while. His power to sever the bonds that held people's sanity in place had been the foundation of Akechi's illustrious career under Shido. But considering where that career had ended up, he'd almost resented the persona ever since. And they never had much of a rapport even before that. During his time with the Phantom Thieves, Akechi had listened to the enthusiastic way they discussed their own personas with a quiet mix of confusion and disgust. He'd thought it was like grown adults chatting with imaginary friends. Ryuji had practically been on the verge of starting a Captain Kidd fan club. And Akira had offhandedly mentioned talking with his own persona. as if the voices in his head were members of a bridge club he stopped by to visit every weekend. But from Loki, he remembered nothing. Just mute acceptance and mask, and there he'd been. His voice, if he'd ever had one, was an empty wind blowing through the canyon of Akechi's own mind. Still, Akechi drew himself up now, tried to look commanding. "Set him free," he said, gesturing to Akira. "Can you do that?" Loki didn't nod or speak. He merely hopped off Leviathan's hilt. He seized the blade, held it high. The air glinted gold as he reared back in front of Akira. No, wait! Akechi jumped between the two with palms splayed out as the blade hissed through the air. Its edge stopped a fraction of an inch from Akechi's head. It nearly embedded itself in what remained of its helmet. From where he stood, Akechi saw Loki's face bisected by the sword, and mirrored again by the crack in his visor. A snarl of faceless reflections. "I didn't tell you to kill him! That's not what I meant!" He felt a sliver of doubt in his mind and smashed it flat. Loki's expressionless inkblot of a face, for an instant, looked faintly smug. Akechi's vision flashed red. "You're completely worthless!" he screamed, and a detached thought in the back of his mind remarked on how foolish this all was, how his voice cracked when he shouted like a sulky adolescent, how he was condemning a mute and apathetic reflection of his own heart, but he kept going anyway. "Ever since you came to me, all you've done is give me grief. Mental shutdowns, psychotic breakdowns, driving people insane, and all of it for what? What did it bring me? And now look at you! All you were ever good for was hurting people, and now you're less than useless!" He smacked the blade aside. "Get away from me! Get out of my sight!" Loki obligingly disappeared. Akechi was left panting and red-faced, claws restlessly scraping against one another. He looked over his shoulder at the unconscious Akira. "I apologize for that sorry display, Joker. Maybe your bond will be a little more useful, His voice was bright and jolly. He could feel his mind slipping free of its moorings again. "No matter. One thing at a time. Don't think of what Shimizu might be doing to the others. It would be counterproductive for him to go mad now." He reached into the void within himself and grabbed hold of the other mask there. "Come out! Robin Hood!" His other persona materialized in a rush of wind that stung Akechi's face and blew back his tattered cape. Robin Hood's own cape continued to flutter in a breeze unseen. He had his great bow planted on the ground, his free hand on his hip. That beak-crested face looked from Akira to Akechi and back again like a custodian taking in a particularly filthy room. "Save him." There was an edge of desperation in his voice now. "I know you're just me. I know you can't do anything I can't do, but you saved me, right? I never asked you to, but you did. There must be something you can do. Some trick. You're so full of tricks." He attempted a smile. "Shoot off these chains. Weaken them somehow. Just please. Please."